Welcome back to the deep dive. Today we are heading north, way, way north. We're talking about a place that, takes up this massive chunk of the map.
It really does.
But until, I'd say very recently, it took up almost zero space in the average news cycle. We are talking, of course, about Greenland.
Yeah.
And I know what you're probably thinking. Icebergs, maybe some sled dogs, a cruise stop if you're feeling adventurous. But the material we're looking at today, it tells a completely different story.
Oh, a completely different story. It suggests this giant island is, well, it's rapidly becoming the center of the next great geopolitical chess match.
Right. A chess match. That's a good way to put it.
And it's funny you mentioned the map because on most standard maps, Greenland is, it's totally distorted. It looks enormous, like the size of Africa or something, which of course it isn't.
The Mercator projection, right, stretches out the poles.
Really.
Okay.
But if you're talking about its strategic weight, it might actually be even bigger than we give it credit for. The stuff we've been digging into, it paints Greenland not as this, passive block of ice,
They're just sitting there.
but as a real pivot point for global security, for economic dominance, and honestly, for the future of the entire Arctic.
And I think for most people, the moment they woke up to this reality was a few years ago when Donald Trump just, fires off a tweet saying he wanted to buy the place. Everybody laughed. It was a meme overnight. The Prime Minister of Denmark, I remember she called it absurd. But what we're going to unpack today, based on our source material, is that, well, it wasn't really a joke.
Not at all. Clumsy, maybe.
Clumsy, for sure, but the logic behind it, that was deadly serious. So today, we're going to look at the three main pillars that really define this whole situation. First, the surprisingly intense history of the U.S. trying to control Greenland.
Which goes way back.
Way back. Second, the very specific economic and military reasons why the U.S., and the text we have, makes a point of separating this. Why the U.S., and specifically the Trump doctrine, wants it so badly right now. And finally, where all of this is heading.
And to get where it's heading, you really have to understand that this idea of buying territory, it's not a new concept for the United States. And the obsession with Greenland, I mean, this is not a 2019 phenomenon. It is a saga. It goes back centuries. Okay, so let's start right there. Part one, the history.
Yeah.
Because for most of us, I think Greenland is just, it's Danish. It's part of the Kingdom of Denmark. End of story. So how did we get from, Viking settlements to a place that arguably has more American military infrastructure than Danish?
Yeah.
It's a complicated marriage, let's call it that. Greenland has been tied to Scandinavia since the Viking Age. We're talking around 982 AD with Eric the Red.
The famous one?
The very one.
Right.
But the modern colonial relationship that really kicks off in 1721 with a missionary named Hans Eged, he goes up there looking for lost Norse farmers, these old Viking descendants. He doesn't find them.
They were long gone by then, right?
Long gone. But he did find the Inuit people. And that's what really kicked off the formal Danish colonial era. But the pivot point, the moment where the U.S. really enters the chat, as they say, is World War II.
This is the part of the backstory that just blew my mind. So Germany invades Denmark in April 1940. Copenhagen is occupied. So technically, the owner of Greenland is now under Nazi control. What on earth happens to this giant isolated island?
This is one of those incredible footnotes in history that changes everything. The Danish ambassador to the U.S. at the time was a man named Henrik Kaufmann.
Okay.
And when Denmark fell, he basically went rogue. He just declared on his own authority that he alone represented the free interests of Denmark. He refused to take any orders from the Nazi-controlled government back in Copenhagen.
Wow, so he just appointed himself the leader of Free Denmark in Washington.
That's pretty much what he did. He looked at the map, he saw the Atlantic Ocean, he saw the German U-boats sinking Allied ships, and he turned to Washington for help.
So he didn't hand the keys over exactly, but he invited the U.S. in.
In a way, yes.
Yeah.
A very significant way. On April 9th, 1941, and get this, that's exactly 1 year to the day after the German occupation of Denmark.
1 year. Wow, that's symbolic.
Highly symbolic. Kaufmann signed an agreement with the U.S. Secretary of State, and this agreement allowed the United States to build bases, airfields, weather stations, you name it, all over Greenland for the stated purpose of protecting it from Germany.
And that was it. That was the moment Greenland went from being this sort of remote European outpost to a North American strategic fortress.
That's the moment. And they didn't just build one or two. The U.S. built something like 17 distinct facilities there during the war. They poured in resources.
17? And they never really left, did they, after the war ended?
Not really, no.
Yeah.
The war ends, Denmark gets its sovereignty back, technically, but almost immediately the Cold War starts.
Right, new enemy.
New enemy, same map. And if you look at a globe from the top down, the polar view, Greenland is just the shortest, most direct path between the Soviet Union and the United States for bombers and missiles.
The Great Circle Route.
Exactly. It suddenly became, you could argue, the single most valuable piece of real estate on the planet for nuclear deterrence.
Which brings us then to the first time the U.S. actually tried to buy it, because 2019, as you said, wasn't the first attempt.
No, not by a long shot. In 1946, President Harry Truman saw that same strategic value. He was very blunt about it. He had the State Department make a formal, secret offer to Denmark.
And what was the offer?
$100 million in gold bars for the entire island.
$100 million in gold. In 1946, money? I mean, that sounds like an astronomical sum for back then.
It was a massive amount of money. But here's the thing. Denmark said no.
Why? I mean, they were recovering from the war. That must have been tempting.
It was. But it was a matter of national pride, for one. And they also expressed a sense of, responsibility to the Greenlandic people. You can't just sell people. But, and this is the key part, even though they said no to the sale, they said yes to the military presence.
Ah, so they kept the island but let the U.S. keep its foothold.
Massive foothold. In 1951, they signed a new defense treaty. And this is the one that gave the U.S. permanent rights to Thule Air Base.
Thule. That's a name that just keeps popping up in all the source material. It's way up there, isn't it? Deep in the north.
It is deep inside the Arctic Circle. I mean, it is remote. It's the U.S. military's northernmost installation anywhere in the world.
And during the Cold War, what was its main function?
It was the absolute backbone of the Ballistic Missile Early Warning System, or BMUWS.
BMUWS.
Okay.
So if the Soviets launched a nuclear missile over the pole, the giant radar domes at Thule would be the very first things to see it. It essentially guaranteed the USA a 15-minute warning to retaliate.
15 minutes. That's it. That's it. But without Greenland, without Seoul, the entire logic of mutually assured destruction, MAD, it doesn't quite work the same way. That warning time was everything.
There's also that completely insane story from the late 50s. I feel like we have to talk about Project Iceworm just to illustrate how deep the U.S. dug in. I mean, literally dug in.
Oh, Project Iceworm is wild. It's like something out of a James Bond movie. The U.S. Army literally carved an entire city under the ice sheet. It was called Camp Century.
A city, not just a base.
A city. It had labs, a hospital, a theater, a chapel, and it was all powered by a portable nuclear reactor.
Unbelievable. And what was the public reason for this?
The public cover story was science. Polar research, studying the ice cap. And they could do some of that. They drilled the first ice core sample that proved past climate change.
But the reality?
The reality, the top secret part, was a plan codenamed Project Iceworm. The idea was to build a massive network of tunnels under the ice.
Yeah.
And in those tunnels, they were going to deploy up to 600 nuclear missiles on real cars.
So they'd be constantly moving.
Constantly moving. So the Soviets could never target them for a first strike.
Yeah.
It was meant to be the ultimate survivable nuclear force.
Nuclear missiles on trains under the ice cap. You really can't make this stuff up.
You really can't. They eventually had to abandon it. The ice sheet, it turns out, is not static. It moves and flows like a very slow river, and it started crushing the tunnels.
Wow.
But it just shows the length the U.S. was willing to go to. Yeah. They viewed Greenland as, for all intents and purposes, an extension of American territory. It was theirs in everything but name.
Okay, so let's fast forward a bit through the decades. We have this intense, deep-rooted military history, but on the political side, Greenland itself has been changing. It's been slowly drifting away from Denmark, right?
Yes, that's a parallel and equally important story. In 1953, its official status changed. It stopped being a colony and became a county of Denmark, like an integrated part.
So an upgrade, a bit of an upgrade. Then a much bigger step. In 1979, they got home rule. This gave them their own parliament, their own flag. And then the really big one was in 2009, the Self-Rule Act. And what did that do?
This was huge. It recognized Greenlanders, the Inuit, and other residents as a distinct people under international law. It gave them control over their own police force, their courts, and this is absolutely crucial for our story, their natural resources.
That resource control is the key, isn't it? That feels like the moment where the story pivots from being just about a strategic military base to also being about an economic treasure chest.
That is the exact pivot point. Under the Self-Rule Act, Greenland, not Denmark, owns what is in the ground. Denmark still handles foreign policy and defense and provides a huge subsidy. But if a company wants to mine for gold, or more importantly, rare earths, they have to talk to the government in Nuuk, the capital of Greenland.
Not Copenhagen.
Not Copenhagen. And that economic opening is precisely what caught the eye of global powers in the 21st century. including, very loudly, Donald Trump. Okay, so that's a perfect transition. Let's get into that. Part two. The desire. Why did Donald Trump, and as the source material says, the broader U.S. apparatus, suddenly decide in 2019 that they needed to put a sold sign on the world's biggest island? We've established it wasn't a joke, so what were the actual specific drivers? Well, when you peel back all the chaotic rhetoric of the time, the analysis shows there are two main drivers. They're interconnected but distinct. The first is great power competition, primarily with China and Russia, and the second is rare earth elements.
Well, let's start with the minerals, the rare earth.
Okay, so we are living in a world that is completely driven by high technology.
Okay.
Our phones, electric vehicles, the F-35 fighter jet, wind turbines.
Everything.
Everything. All of these things require a set of 17 metals on the periodic table called rare earth elements. Things with names like neodymium, dysprosium, terbium.
And right now, who controls that market? It's not the U.S.
It is overwhelmingly China. China controls somewhere between 80 to 90% of the global processing of rare earths. The United States is, frankly, terrifyingly dependent on a strategic rival for the materials it needs to build its own most advanced weapon systems and its own green energy grid. It's a massive national security vulnerability.
A huge Achilles heel. And Greenland is seen as the solution to that problem.
It's seen as a major part of a potential solution.
Oh.
Southern Greenland, specifically an area there called Kvanefjeld, is home to one of the largest undeveloped deposits of rare earth metals and uranium, which is controversial in the entire world.
So it's just sitting there.
It's just sitting there. Geological surveys suggest it could supply a significant chunk of global demand for decades to come.
So you can just picture it. Trump is in the middle of this huge trade war with China. He sees this massive vulnerability in the supply chain, and then he looks at the map and sees this giant island sitting right there with the solution literally buried in the rock.
That is precisely the logic. And here is where the Trump factor, the personality, meshes with the broader U.S. factor, the institutional interest. The U.S. State Department, the Pentagon, they'd had been worried about this dependency for years. They'd written reports, held hearings.
It's a low bureaucratic way.
Exactly. But Trump's approach, the transactional real estate developer mindset, was to just cut the Gordian knot. Why bother with complex trade deals or messy mining rights negotiations with a tiny government when you can just buy the whole asset?
It's vertical integration on a geopolitical scale. You buy the mine, you own the supply chain.
It is, and there was a real sense of urgency because Chinese state-owned companies were already on the ground. They were sniffing around. A Chinese company called Sheng Resources had already bought a large minority stake in the Australian company that was trying to get the license to mine Kvanefjeld.
So China was already making a play.
A serious play. And it wasn't just mining. Another Chinese state-owned company tried to bid on a contract to build and finance 3 new airports in Greenland.
I remember that airport story. That caused a huge stir behind the scenes, didn't it? The U.S. panicked.
They absolutely did.
Yeah.
The Pentagon, according to reports, basically went to Copenhagen and told the Danish government, you cannot let this happen. You have to stop this.
What was the fear?
The fear was twofold. First, that if China built the airports, they might gain control over the airspace or install surveillance equipment. Second, and more likely, was debt-trap diplomacy. China finances the airports, the tiny Greenlandic economy can't pay back the loans, and China says, okay, no problem, just give us a 99-year lease on the airport, or give us exclusive mining rights.
The same playbook they've used in other parts of the world.
The exact same playbook. The U.S. eventually had to lean on Denmark to step in and co-finance the airports just to push the Chinese out. So when Trump came out a year later and said, let's buy Greenland, it was really just the loud public version of this quiet, intense war that was already happening behind the scenes.
Okay, so that's the minerals. What about the other driver you mentioned? You said great power competition, but also climate change.
Right. And this is the great, strange irony of the 21st century. The burning of fossil fuels is melting the Arctic ice, which in turn is revealing more fossil fuels to drill for, and crucially, opening up new shipping routes.
The Polar Silk Road, as the Chinese call it.
That's their term for it. As the Arctic sea ice recedes in the summer, new sea lanes are opening up. Shipping from, say, Shanghai to Rotterdam via the Arctic is weeks faster and thousands of miles shorter than going all the way down through the Suez Canal.
So it's a massive economic prize. And whoever controls the coastlines along that new route, they basically control the toll booth of the future global economy.
Essentially, yes.
Yeah.
And who has the longest Arctic coastline by far? Russia.
Russia.
And they are militarizing it heavily. They're reopening old Soviet-era bases. They're testing new hypersonic missiles in the Arctic. They're deploying a fleet of nuclear-powered icebreakers to control the lanes.
So the U.S. is looking at this map again.
Always back to the mat. And they're realizing that on the North American side of the pole, they have Alaska, which is great. And then there's, the Canadian archipelago, which is a maze of islands and ice, very tricky to navigate and control. And then there's Greenland.
It's the anchor.
It is the strategic anchor. Controlling Greenland, or at least having it firmly in your camp, secures the entire eastern flank of North America. It closes the most important gap on the map.
We've talked about the GI-UK gap in a previous deep dive on NATO. That's the Greenland-Iceland-UK gap. This is the choke point for Russian submarines trying to get from their northern bases out into the open Atlantic.
Exactly. For decades, NATO's strategy has been to bottle up the Soviet, now Russian Navy behind that gap. You lose access to bases and monitoring stations in Greenland. You lose your ability to effectively monitor that gap.
And the nightmare scenario for Washington is what?
The nightmare scenario is that Greenland becomes fully independent from Denmark. And then, because it's desperate for cash, it signs a defense treaty or a major economic partnership with China or Russia.
A Chinese naval base in Greenland.
Imagine that. It would be like having a Soviet base in Cuba during the Cold War. But this one comes with an unlimited supply of critical minerals and controls the future of Arctic shipping. It is an existential threat from the Pentagon's point of view.
So the desire we're talking about, it isn't just about greed for resources. It's about this deep existential anxiety. The U.S. sees the chessboard changing because of climate change and China's rise, and it realizes its dominant position isn't as secure as it was in 1950.
And that's why the text is smart to distinguish between Trump and the U.S. Trump brought that transactional, let's just buy it, energy. He made it simple. But the U.S. institution, the Pentagon, the State Department, the intelligence community, they want influence. They want control. They might not need to own the deed to the house, but they need to make damn sure they know who has the keys, which is the perfect segue to our final section, part 3, the future. What happens next? We have this immovable object, which is Greenland's very real desire for independence, meeting this unstoppable force of America's strategic interest. The source material talks about future development expectations. What are the actual plausible scenarios on the table? Well, the forecast is tricky because so much of it depends on the simple economics of independence. Right now, as much as Greenland has self-rule, it is still heavily dependent on Denmark.
How dependent?
They receive what's called a block grant from Copenhagen every single year. It's about $600 million US, and that grant covers more than half of their entire public budget.
More than half. So if they declare full independence tomorrow, they instantly lose over half of the money they use to run their schools, their hospitals, everything.
It would be an economic catastrophe. For a population of only about 56,000 people, that's a massive hole to fill.
56,000. That's the size of a small town.
It is. And this is precisely where the United States sees its opening. The prediction, based on the analysis we have, is that the U.S. won't try to buy the island in a big, clumsy lump sum again. That was a PR disaster.
Right.
Instead, the strategy is to try and become Greenland's new economic patron. They want to essentially replace the Danish block grant with American investment and aid.
So basically swapping one landlord for another.
That is certainly the cynic's view, and it's a fear you hear from many Greenlanders. But the U.S. strategy has already visibly shifted toward soft power. In 2020, for the first time in decades, the U.S. reopened a consulate in the capital, Nuuk.
Okay, that's a big diplomatic signal.
A huge signal. And soon after, they announced a $12.1 million aid package. And it was specifically for civilian projects, education, tourism development, sustainable energy, not military stuff.
Still, $12 million is a very long way from $600 million.
It is, but you have to see it as a down payment, a toe in the water. The expectation is that this is the beginning. The next step will be encouraging, maybe even subsidizing American and allied companies to invest heavily in Greenland's mining sector to get those rare earths out of the ground.
So the idea is, if the U.S. can help Greenland build a self-sustaining economy based on mining and tourism, an economy that doesn't need Danish money,
then Greenland might feel confident enough to hold a referendum and vote for full independence from Denmark.
Wait, that seems counterintuitive. wouldn't the U.S. want Greenland to stay with Denmark? I mean, Denmark is a safe, stable, boring NATO ally, and independent Greenland sounds like a total wild card.
And that is the core debate happening inside Washington right now. Some strategists think exactly that the status quo is the safest bet. But there's another more aggressive school of thought.
Which argues what?
It argues that an independent Greenland, with that tiny population and those huge budgetary needs, would actually be much easier for the United States to influence and control than a Greenland that's part of the Kingdom of Denmark and protected by the European Union.
Because if Greenland is independent, it's a simple bilateral relationship, just nuke in Washington, no need to go through Copenhagen or Brussels.
Exactly. It simplifies the power dynamic enormously.
That sounds potentially predatory.
It's classic great power politics. The future direction outlined in our research really suggests this intense tug of war for the soul of the island. On one side, you have the independence movement within Greenland, which is very real and very popular. It's led by parties like Inuit Ataqatigiit and Siamat.
And what do they want? They want full sovereignty. They want to revive the Inuit language and culture, to step out of Denmark's colonial shadow once and for all. But they face this horrible dilemma. To afford that freedom, do they have to turn their pristine Arctic environment into a giant open-pit mine? And if they do decide to mine, who do they sell the ore to? The U.S. or China?
That's the billion-dollar question.
Yeah.
And the U.S. is betting that when push comes to shove, they can make the better offer.
Or maybe just a safer offer.
That's probably a better way to put it. The U.S. brings the NATO security umbrella. It brings partnership with a democracy. China brings cash, yes, but it also brings debt and the potential forfeiture of your most valuable assets if you can't pay.
But we shouldn't underestimate the Greenlandic people in all this.
Absolutely not. That's a key point in the analysis. They are incredibly savvy political actors. They've been navigating the interests of great powers, Denmark, the U.S., for over a century. They might just be able to play everyone off against each other to get the best possible deal for themselves, maintaining their independence from everyone.
So the future isn't a literal purchase like the Louisiana Purchase. We're looking at something more subtle, a gradual integration.
I think integration by infrastructure is the phrase to use. Expect to see more American money flowing into Greenland's airports, its deepwater ports, its telecommunications, and its mines. Expect more scientific cooperation, more student exchanges. The U.S. military presence at Thule will almost certainly be modernized and expanded.
So the direction of travel is clear. It's more America in Greenland, not less.
Definitely more. The only real question is whether that comes in the form of a genuine partnership or under immense pressure.
It's fascinating how this closes the loop on the whole story. We started with Hans Egede colonizing Greenland for Denmark back in the 1700s. We moved to World War II, where the U.S. stepped in as the de facto protector. And now we're looking at a potential future where Greenland is nominally independent, but functionally, it's integrated into the North American economic and security sphere.
It really is a return to geography. Geologically, Greenland is part of the North American tectonic plate. It's been politically tied to Europe for 300 years, but you could say that the gravity of its own continent is finally pulling it back west.
Okay, let's try to recap this whole journey, because we have covered a lot of ground. We started with the history, and we saw that this American obsession with Greenland isn't new. It's not a Trump-era invention. From that 1941 agreement with Ambassador Kaufman to the 1946 offer of gold bars, the U.S. has always viewed Greenland as a vital, unsinkable aircraft carrier.
Right. The history proves that the strategic intent is structural. It's not just the whim of one particular president.
Then we moved on and looked at the geopolitical desire. We broke down that Trump and U.S. interests. And it's not about building golf courses. It's about securing neodymium for magnets and F-35s. It's about making sure Chinese technology can't dominate. And it's about controlling the future shipping lanes of a rapidly melting Arctic.
It's fundamentally about securing the future supply chain and defending the northern border in a world that's changing incredibly fast.
And finally, we looked at the future expectations. And we aren't predicting a for sale sign going up anytime soon. But we are predicting this profound shift in gravity. The U.S. is moving in methodically with aid, with diplomacy, with investment, all potentially paving the way for a future Greenland that relies on Washington instead of Copenhagen.
The trajectory is clear. The Arctic is heating up both literally and politically. And Greenland is, in many ways, the grand prize.
So here's the final provocative thought I want to leave you with based on everything we've discussed. We often think of history, things like colonialism and empire building, as something that happened in the past. We like to think that era is over. But if you look closely at what's happening in Greenland, Are we just watching a modern 21st century version of empire building happening in real time with checkbooks and contracts instead of gunboats?
Hmm.
And if the U.S. succeeds in this long game of pulling Greenland into its orbit, does that make Greenland the first true superpower acquisition of the new climate era?
That is the billion-dollar question, isn't it?
Yeah.
It completely redefines what it means to be a strategic asset in a warming world.
Something for you to think about next time you see a map of the Arctic. Thanks for listening to The Deep Dive. We'll see you next time.